Welcome back to net.touchplus.com. By popular demand, I'm back with JavaScript from Null Chapter 6. And what we are going to do today is build upon what we learned in Chapter 5. So if you haven't watched that one yet, I recommend you do. But with that said, you don't really have to. We're building this code from scratch, so it'll help you learn some of the concepts in Chapter 5. But if you have a decent knowledge of JavaScript, skip it. Go ahead and watch this. So what we learned about in Chapter 5 was the very beginnings of event handling, the kind of the issues with Firefox versus Internet Explorer. For example, when binding events, we can use add-event listener with modern browsers, Firefox, Safari, Chrome. Internet Explorer, up until IE 9, which is coming out soon, used its own form, which was like attach event, and we had to figure out how to compensate. So we did a very kind of like your first event binding type lesson. But today we're going to take that further, and we're actually going to build a professional level add event function that you can use in all your projects. And this will be cross-browser. It will work great. Much more advanced than what we did in Chapter 5. Okay, so I am going into Espresso. Here's my project. And I have a blank page. So let's go ahead and begin. We'll create script tags. And within here, we need to create our function. And this is going to be, that's pretty common. We'll call it add event. So we could do something like function add event. Okay, this is one way to create a function. Another way is to create it like this, var add event equals function. Now, as we are creating a variable, in this case, you would want to add a semicolon to the end, but with the function version, you can get away without doing it. So let's take a look at ultimately how we want to call this. So to do so, I need to go ahead and create some beginning markup. So let's create maybe a div with an ID of container, and then a child of div ID equals main, then a child of div or a UL of nav, and then list items times 4, and then we'll give them some lorem text. Okay, just a bunch of gibberish markup that we can get started with. If I want to go ahead and preview that, pretty much what you'd expect, right? Okie dokie, so let's go in here, and ultimately we want to be able to do something like this, and we want to say document get element by ID, or I'm sorry, elements by tag name, and let's get those list items, and we will say add event, and we want to say maybe listen for a click event, and then do some kind of function. And add event will take care of any cross-browser issues that we have to worry about. Okay, so let's begin building this. So what I'm going to do here is we will begin with the basics, and slowly we'll expand our code to compensate for other issues, other browsers. That way it's not too much at once, hopefully. So the first thing we need to do is figure out if the browser is a modern browser and supports add event listener. So our first step is to do something like if document.add event listener. And as I said, we're going to expand to this. So if you think there's a better way, good for you. We'll go to that later. So if the browser understands add event listener, then we can take advantage of it. And we'll say something like if, and we need to make sure that this function accepts the parameters that we pass in. So I want to make sure it accepts the element. What are we attaching the event handler to? The next one is, what kind of event is it? Is it a hover event? Is it a click event? Is it a key press event? Something like that. And then finally, we need a callback function. And this is going to happen, this is our event handler. So right there. And we'll call that CB. We could call it func, fn, whatever. And that'll do it. So now I'm going to say if element exists, because they're going to pass in an element. We want to make sure that that actually is an element, right? So we'll do that and say if that exists and it doesn't have a length. And you know what? Let's just keep it like this for now. I don't want to throw too much code at you once. So if it exists, then element.add event listener. And add event listener, as we learned in the previous lesson, we need to specify the type. So let's hard code this in first. And we'll say the type is going to be, I don't know, click. And then the callback function, we can call the CB right here. This will be equal to a callback function. So if we remembered when we call it, we'd say add event, maybe to some anchor tag, and then we're going to listen for the click event, and then we're going to run a callback function, and this is what's going to happen when that element is clicked, right? And this will be the callback. And this function right here will be then represented by CB. So we will call that. Finally, addEventListener accepts a third parameter, and this is whether we should capture or bubble up. You learned this in Chapter 5. Internet Explorer does not support capturing the capturing phase. It only supports the bubbling phase. I'm going to keep it with false right now, and that just means we're just going to deal with bubbling for now. So if the element exists, go ahead and add an event listener. We're going to listen for click, and let's get rid of that hard coding in. We don't need that. Type. So add event listener, click event, run the callback function, and we will bubble. We'll use the bubble phase rather than the capture phase. So now we can call it, and let's try it out. Add event listener, and we need to grab something. So I'll say var li equals documents.get elements by tag name li, and we're just going to get the first one for now. So we will listen for when the very first list item right here is clicked upon. All right. Add event listener to the li. I want to listen for, and we can just come up here if we ever forget. I want to listen for the click event. And then I'm going to run a callback function. Now, for now, let's just alert clicked. Keep it simple. All right, hopefully we did it right. So I'm going to preview. I'm going to click on these other ones. Nothing happens. Good. Now let's click on the very top one. And we do get clicked. Cool. Very cool. Now that we can confirm this works in modern browsers, at least we think, let's make sure it works in IE. And if you watched the previous lesson, you should know that maybe not. So I have the same page open. Let's refresh it. Click around. Okay, nothing works. Let's click on the very first list item, and still nothing is happening. What's going on here? Why isn't this working? As we learned in Chapter 5, it's because Internet Explorer, until IE 9, which I don't have installed yet, doesn't support addEventListener. It uses its own version of attachEvent. So now we can compensate for this. And we'll say right here, else if document.attachEvent, this is how Internet Explorer wants to see it, then we need to make them happy. In this case, we'll do it again. We'll say if element exists, element.attachEvent. And one other difference between addEventListener and attachEvent, there's actually several differences, but one of them, most noticeably, is that we need to apply on. So while addEventListener can do click, Internet Explorer wants to see on click. Okay, more like the traditional way of binding events, like document.getElement by ID, some ID, .onClick. That's kind of the traditional, the old way of doing it. That's kind of what they want, is on plus the event listener. So we'll say on plus type. That's easy. And next, Internet Explorer does not only supports bubbling. It does not support a capturing phase, so there is no third parameter. So the second one just needs to be our callback. And whoops. And in that case, we can just run callback CB again. So as we think this might work, let's try it out. Refresh. I'm going to click it. Good, it's working. So now we know it's working in all browsers, but that's not the extent of it. This is about what we went to in Chapter 5, but there's a lot more we need to do really if we want to really rely on these. The first one is the event object. So with addEventListener, we have an event object available to us, and this contains contextual information about the event. So this can be represented with event or EVT or E, whatever you want. And in this case, let's console.log this in Firebug and see what we get. So I'm going to go and open up Firefox, and let's open up our project. Bring this down just a bit, and let's click on it. And console.log, let's refresh, try it again. There we go. And here is our event object. Now, we have various things available to us. The target, we have things about where it was clicked on screen X and screen Y. We open up original target. You can see what was clicked on, the list item. You have a lot of helpful stuff. Most noticeably, you'll use it for things like the mouse coordinates of when you clicked. So if you want to search through here, feel free to do it on your own. Lots of cool stuff here that you'll use. Now the problem is, again, Internet Explorer handles the event object in its own way. So and this is being changed, but while modern browsers do receive this event object, Internet Explorer, especially older versions, will need to access it via window.event. So what we have to do here is override it, and we'll say E, and we're going to say if E exists, use that. E equals E or window.event. And this way we can be positive that it's referring to the same object. So they offer slightly different things, so they're not identical, but at least this way we can get around it. Now another issue we have to deal with is the this keyword. So if you haven't learned it yet, the this keyword refers to the object. So in this case, we're adding event to a list item and listening for it when it's clicked. Within the confines of this function, this will refer to the list item that was clicked. All right. But Internet Explorer doesn't deal with it this way. While modern browsers will treat this in that way, Internet Explorer is going to refer to the window, which is extremely unhelpful. Let's check it out. Let's do alert this dot node name. Let's just do that. And refresh, and I click, and sure enough, it is the list item. But if we go into IE and refresh, click on it, we're going to get undefined. So it's referring to the window. So we have to figure out a way to fix that, to make sure that even in Internet Explorer, within this function, this refers to the list item that was clicked. So luckily, there's kind of a cool way we can get around this, and you're going to learn a new function called call. This is a JavaScript built-in function, call, and this allows us to call a function or method, but we can pass arguments to it, but we can also specify what the context is, what this should be equal to when we call that function. It's very helpful. So rather than just doing this, we'll run a function like so. And within this function, I'm just keeping it all on one line to save time. I'm going to return CB, get that function, and we're going to call it. Now, within here, it accepts two parameters. The first one is what are we going to use as this? And I want to make sure that the element that was clicked on is used as this. Second should be any special arguments that we're going to pass. If we need to pass anything from up here, maybe for this, we really don't need to pass anything. If you want to pass maybe the type or the element itself, whatever you want. We'll keep it like this. So now, rather than just calling the function directly, we are using the call function and specifying that this should refer to the element. So let's try it now, and hopefully we fixed it. Refresh, click, and now it refers to the list item. Cool, so now we're making this way more cross-browser compatible. Now we have another problem. Let's change this, and rather than grabbing a single element, we want to attach this click listener, this click handler to all list items on the page, every single one of these. So we're going to get a problem here. So let's go into Firefox, refresh. Element.addEventListener is not a function. So truthfully, this isn't very helpful to us. But what the problem is that in this case, we are passing a collection of items. So it's not really an array, but it's array-like. Get elements by tag name will return a collection. Now, let's go through this code, and we're saying if element.addEventListener, but we're saying pretty much array addEventListener. And we can't really do that. We need to filter through them and then add an event listener to each one, each list item in that case. So we go back and we'll do it right here. And we need to figure out if there is a length to this collection. So in that case, we'll say if element and there is no length. An array or a collection will have a length associated with it, just a regular variable will not. So now we can do an else statement, and I'll say else if elem exists and elem.length. We'll just be very specific here. Then run this code, and this means is collection, right? So now we'll say, let's first get the length of the collection. So we'll say elem.length. It's kind of a good practice. If we want, we can kind of shorten this up to len. And now I'm going to filter through them. So for var I equals 0, I is less than length, I plus plus. And all we're doing here is we're filtering through all the items in the collection and adding an event handler. So we'll say add event. And this is kind of a cool trick. So we are calling the function right here. So we're going to have to figure out a way to work with that. But we'll do it the simple way first. And we'll say elem I.addEventListener. And here, same thing, type CB false. So now, if what we pass into add event is a collection of items, we filter through every single one. Length will be equal to the number of items, or number of items in that collection. And then for each one, we say LMI. And so this will be get the very first list item, then filter through. I will increase by 1. Then we get the next item, then the next item. And each one we bind add event listener, and we bind whatever we pass in. So let's try that now. If I refresh, if I click, now it's working. We're filtering through those. Very cool. But again, with Internet Explorer, it's not going to work because we haven't written any specific code for IE. So, like I said, we're going to keep cleaning this up, but seemingly we need to kind of mimic this code for IE. So we can do this right here. If lm and not lm.length, then do that. And then we can kind of grab this code right here, just for now, and paste it in. And right here, we need to change that to attach event. And as you'll learn shortly, we can clean this up quite a bit more. And you know what? Let's grab this because we can just use this code right there and make sure we replace that. That's a little cleaner, and we remember to prefix on. All right, let's try that. Refresh, and now if I click on it, we get undefined. And that's because right here, see return cb.call, we're passing in that array. We want to make sure we pass in that specific element. Now, we're going to see that it's still undefined, and unfortunately, this is an issue where we need to implement a closure. So you can see right here, why don't we try changing this? By the way, we're going to clean this up, but just to give you an idea of how we could do it, why don't we change this and then call it, and we'll pass I in, because I needs to increment correctly. So we'll change it like so. And now let's go back and try it. Refresh. Yeah, and now it's referring to each of those list items that was clicked. Okay, is there a cleaner way that we can do this? Yes. The first thing that we're doing right here, though, is every time it's going to be you will add events all the time. But here, every single time we do it, we check to see if we can add an event listener to the document. Doesn't that seem kind of needless? Why do we have to check every single time? Shouldn't we check one time? Yes. So here's what we're going to do. Rather than making add event equal to a function, where every time add event is called, this function runs, why don't we first run a function that determines whether we can use this? So you'll learn this function, and then go to the very bottom at the end of our function and call it. So we can wrap these parentheses. Technically, they're not needed, but what they are there for is to let the other coders read and know, okay, something's happening here. This function is being called immediately. So without this code, this function will only run when we call it. But as soon as we call it, see these parentheses, it's kind of like saying call the function. In that case, and I can clean that up. In that case, as soon as the page loads and it gets here, this function is going to run. Okay, well, that helps, but we still need to have a function available to us. So let's do this. Let's go ahead and get rid of this code right here, like so. And now within here, we'll say if document that add event listener, good, and we'll say return a function. Paste that in, and we can close this out right here. Okay, so this is what's pretty cool, is when the page loads, we run the function, okay, and we check to see if document.addEventListener is available. And that only runs one single time when the page loads. We don't have to do it every single time we add an event, which could be often. And it returns a function. So when the page loads, it checks that, and it returns a function. And this function is then equal to addEvent. So it's the same thing as we did addEvent equals function. And then the contents of here. But by doing it this way, we get to do a little bit of code first, and then we return the function. Okay? And so we return a function, and then we just do the same thing here, where we see if they passed in a variable or if they passed in a collection. I'll go ahead and get rid of that. And then we filter through it. Here's the end of our return statement and end of our addEventListener. Next, this is the code for isIE. And we'll say if document.attachEvent, then we'll do the same thing. And we'll return the function, like so. And I'll go down to the very bottom again. Now, one thing you need to keep note of is when you are returning, whether you're returning a variable or a function, make sure you end that with a semicolon. Okay? It would be the same thing as if you did return true or something. You would end that in a semicolon. So just because you're doing a function, you still need to end that in a semicolon. Okay? And I probably need to do that up here as well. Okay, so this is pretty cool what we're doing now. So let's try it out and make sure I didn't make any mistakes at all. Refresh. Good, it's still working, but the difference is, and this is just happening behind the scenes, is that now we're not checking for add event listener or attach event every single time this function is called. We're only doing that one time when the page loads. It's a pretty cool thing. So remember, if you ever want to call a function immediately, so if you have a function and you want to call it, make sure you append the opening and closing parentheses after it. So function, and then call. Okay. Next, let's come back and clean up this code a little bit more. So what we're doing here is we're adding an event listener if there is a collection to each one. But you notice here how it's almost the exact same thing as what we have up here. So we can kind of be clever about this. And we'll say for var I equals 0, I is less than the number in the collection. Then we'll recursively call this function, add event. Pretty cool. And now we'll pass the correct one, the type, and the callback function. All right, so this is pretty cool. We know that with just single variables, we can attach events very easily. So now we're saying if there is a collection here, okay, filter through all of them, and then call the add event function again and pass in just a single element, a single node, all right, represented by I. So we call that, we check if document.addEventListener and Firefox, yes. Then it checks to see if the element exists and there is no length, meaning it's just a single node. Well, we know now that we're passing this single element that returns true, in which case we add the event listener, the type, the CB, and the false. Very cool. So we can get away with this and we can do the exact same thing, incidentally, right down here. So I'll get rid of pretty much all of this. So let's get rid of, and within here, add event, and the exact same thing. I type CB. Very cool. So let's make sure this is all still working. Let's go into IE first, which usually gives us the most trouble. Good, it's working. We're getting that. Let's go into Firefox and try it out. Now it's working for each one. So we have a cool little function right here. So to make sure it works, let's try this out one time. So we're going to add event. We're going to listen for when the list item is clicked. And then we're not going to work with the event object, but we could. And all I want to say is this, remember, will refer to the element it's associated with. In this case, the list item that was clicked on. So we'll say pretty much the list item.style.border, and we'll give it 1 pixel solid red, something like that. Make sure that works. So preview, click it, and now we get the border. Click it, border, border. Very cool. Let's do the same thing in IE. Hopefully it works. Click it, and now we get it. Very cool. So remember, the important thing to take away from all of this is that cross-browser event binding is not easy. But remember, you only have to write this once. So what you could then do, and what we'll do in just a moment, is export this to our own kind of helpers type script file that we can reference with each new project, and you don't have to write this every time. So the second thing I want you to remember is that IE does not recognize this when you're using attach event. This will refer to the window by default. So if I get rid of this right here, and we just call CB again, and let's change it to the first one just for the example. Let's come back, and now if I click on it, it's not going to work. And if we view the error, this.style is null or not an object. And that's again because this does not refer to the element anymore. So we have to specify specifically attach this to the element, which is why we have to create a function and return CB, call the function, pass element as the this param, and then if we want, you can also pass any additional arguments if you need to. Okay, and now if we go back and try it again, that's going to work. All right, so this is really production-ready code. You could do one final fallback if you want to do something simple. You could do like else, and you could do else lm dot on plus the event, something like that. But I think at this point in time, you don't need to do it. Add event listener will take care of the modern browsers, pretty much all the browsers, and then attach event will take care of the latest versions of IE. IE9, in fact, will take care of this one. So you're free to use this code however you want. The last thing we're going to do right here is grab all of this code that we wrote and create a new file. And we'll call it, I don't know, helpers. Paste that in, and now we have our function. So you can add event to anything, and rest assured that it's going to be cross-browser. So let's get rid of all of that. And then anytime you're in a new project and you want to reference it, script source equals helpers. What I do is I upload mine to my own server, and then I've copied it to like a text expander. That way I can easily reference it anytime I'm not working with a JavaScript library. Something like that. And now I can rest assured that it's still going to work. So let me know if you have any questions. This has gone quite a bit further than what we did in Chapter 5, but this is really a better solution. Chapter 5 introduced you to the idea of event binding, and this shows you kind of more of real world of what happens when a collection is passed and whatnot.